How many heroes am I supposed to run? How many evil characters? How many fortresses is too many? I'll tell you. Hey y'all, welcome to Z Temple. Today we're going to be talking about deck ratioing. Now, what is deck ratioing? Basically, it's just how many of each card type should you put in your deck so that you draw the amount you want when you want it. Now, as the title mentions, there are 4 main rules that I use to ratio my decks, but unlike what the title mentions, unfortunately, they are not actually perfect. As I'll mention later, there's a specific kind of deck that these apply to the best, and also, you usually don't follow these rules exactly every time. Every deck breaks them in some way, but they're a good collection of rules that I've found to help push me in the right direction. And usually, if you find yourself straying from these rules, then you'll want to figure out how you can bring yourself at least pretty close to them. So, what are these rules? Well, we are going to look at my Nationals winning deck from 2021 and talk about how it exemplifies some of these rules and also how it doesn't. So, first things first, let's get it sorted. Alright, now that that's taken care of, we can start talking about the rules and seeing how this deck exemplifies them. So, rule number 1, probably the most important, is 11 ways to a hero. Now, you might be saying, what are you talking about? There's only 8 heroes here. What do you mean 11? Well, that's why it's 11 ways to a hero, not just 11 heroes. So, how did I squeeze 3 more ways to a hero out of this deck? One that you might be thinking is Covenant with David, since this one can perform that function usually, given that as an artifact, it can take a king from deck. However, this deck doesn't have any heroes that are kings, so this one doesn't count. What it does have is a strategy that you can no longer utilize anymore due to the reserve rule, but it uses what I call a remnant chain to get the extra 3 ways. Now, for those unaware, remnant is a lost soul that can take a hero from reserve when put in play. Unfortunately, since reserve is no longer accessible on turn 1, this doesn't work anymore. But this deck used it very effectively. So you'd have remnant, and then you'd have hunter to pull remnant, then awake to also pull remnant. So when you add these 3 ways to one of your reserve heroes, plus the 8 heroes in deck, you get 11. Now, why 11? So if you have 11 heroes, that's roughly like a 93% chance that you get one in your opening hand. The reason that I like that specific amount is when I'm thinking of odds, I like to think of if I played 10 games in a row, how often would certain things happen? And if you have 10 heroes, 10 ways to a hero, you're looking at about a 90-ish% chance to have a hero in your opening hand. So if you play 10 games in a row, one of those games, you are very likely to not have a hero in your opening hand. And not having a hero in your opening hand often means that your deck just doesn't ever get off the ground. So I want to avoid that. So I add one more way so that there's at least a coin flip for that 10th game that I potentially can have okay odds to have a hero in every single one of my 10 games in a row. Still a chance that it happens, but at least I like 11 better than 10. But if you want to do 10, you'll still be good most of the time. So the second rule is 7 evil characters. Now, why 7? It's 7 because that's the same number of lost souls. So you have equal odds to draw a lost soul turn 1 that you have to draw an evil character turn 1. Now, sometimes you are going to draw a lost soul and not draw an evil character, just even though they have the same odds. So we usually want to have something that's going to tilt the odds slightly in our favor, that we get an evil character more often than we get a lost soul, to minimize the number of times that we draw a lost soul and have nothing to block with. So most decks that I run these days, I include Darkness. Darkness has become pretty much an auto-include. For those that you don't know, that's a lost soul that when you draw it, if you don't have an evil character in play, you get to search your deck for one. So Lawless is effectively an 8th way to an evil character in the same way that Remnant was an extra way to a hero. But in this deck, I've got Lawless, which can be very similar. So if you have drawn 8 cards of your opening hand, and none of them were evil characters, and you draw Lawless, if you look through the top 6 with Lawless, the odds are about 77% chance that you will find an evil character in those top 6. So Lawless is pretty close to an 8th way to an evil character. It definitely helps tip the odds a little bit. How do I know that it's 77% chance-ish? You can check out my video up there about hypergeometric calculators and how you can use them to analyze your decks. Anyway, 7 evil characters so that you get them about the same rate that you get Lost Souls. So now you might be thinking, okay, cool, 7 evil characters, makes sense, but you don't actually have 7 evil characters. You have 9. What about these guys? So these guys don't actually count because 7 evil characters would be better stated as 7 blocking evil characters. Now, all of these guys are guys that have an ability that affects the battle and can play my enhancements. Deceiver can't play the enhancements, but he does go fetch somebody that does. These 2 guys are both the wrong brigade to be playing my enhancements, and their ability doesn't affect the battle, so they aren't really evil characters. They're more of infrastructure that happens to be an evil character. Now, what is infrastructure? We'll get to that later. For now, we're going to move on to evil enhancements. So the third rule is 5 or less evil enhancements. Now, again, you might be saying, you don't have 5, you have 6. And that's true. This deck does actually just straight up break the rule. Part of the reason for that is that being able to stuff 3 of my 11 ways to a hero into my Lost Soul pile frees up the space that I can expand one of the other ratios, and in this case I chose to put an extra evil enhancement in because I had really good reasons for wanting to run all 6 of these. This is an example of how the rules aren't set in stone. You can differ from them a little bit. But anyway, why is the rule 5 evil enhancements? So there's nothing as like, there's no percentages that I have to give you for why 5 is a good number. But I've just found that 5 is kind of a magic number for low tempo cards, and you'll see that when we get to the 4th rule. But in this case, evil enhancements are what are called what I classify as low tempo cards, because they don't actually do anything to help you progress the game state toward your goals. You can only use them to react to things that the opponent does. So you have to wait until they attack you, you block the evil character, you get initiative, and then you play the enhancement. And then most of the time, all that it does is just stop the opponent. It doesn't actually help you move forward. So if you draw too many evil enhancements at one time, then you can kind of stall out and your deck doesn't move forward. And if you can't win, then the opponent will, doesn't matter how good your defense is, the opponent will eventually break through it. So 5 evil enhancements tends to be about the sweet spot. In this case, I went 1 extra. Oftentimes I'll actually go 1 lower and run only 4, but this one tends to vary. So 4 or 5, good number. The final rule is 5 or less pieces of infrastructure. So I mentioned the word infrastructure before. What I call infrastructure is support cards, which are these 2 columns, that are tempo negative. So what does tempo negative mean? You can check out my video up there where I talk more about tempo and how to classify different cards. But really there are 3 kinds of cards from a tempo perspective: cards that are tempo positive, tempo neutral, and tempo negative. So tempo positive means that the card generates more cards than just itself. So Endless Treasures pre-errata, which it was at the time of this deck, used to draw you 2 cards in addition to the effect that it has now. So this is tempo positive because in addition to replacing itself with a curse or an idol, it also draws 2 cards. So 1 card becomes 3, tempo positive. In the case of Virgin Birth and Ends of the Earth, these are tempo neutral because 1 card becomes 1 other card. In the case of Virgin Birth, you're using the star ability every time, ideally, and that's going to always be 1 card for 1 card. In the case of Ends of the Earth, long term, it's 1 card for several cards, so it's value positive. But in the short term, it will give you 1 good enhancement the turn that you play it, so it's tempo neutral because one card that doesn't directly affect the battle becomes one card that can directly affect the battle. These 4 cards over here are classified as infrastructure because they are tempo negative. Distressing People doesn't replace itself, doesn't generate any extra cards. Transgressors, same thing. Storehouse and Treacherous Land do, like Into the Earth, generate more cards over time, so they're value positive. However, the turn that you play them, they don't generate any cards. Storehouse just straight up does not generate any cards the turn that you play it ever. You have to wait around before you start getting value. Treacherous Land can generate value if the opponent takes certain actions, but I don't want to rely on that. So without relying on the opponent, Treacherous Land is tempo negative, even though it's value positive like Storehouse, because long term it will generate more cards than it costs. But similar to the Evil Enhancement rule, 5 is kind of a magic number because 5 just if you have more than 5, the odds that you draw too many of them at one time and your game engine stalls out is a little too high for my comfort. You can get away with it sometimes, but you're definitely going to increase the odds that you have an opening hand that are just too many low tempo cards. And those games you often are going to lose against decks that do have a critical mass of high tempo cards. So yeah, those are the 4 rules that I use to help me build more consistent decks. Now, it's important to note that these ratios specifically apply to aggressive decks that are planning on trying to punch through the opponent's defense very quickly by setting up strong offensive attacks right from the get-go. And then to complement that, the defense is not going to be focused on outlasting the opponent's offense by actually combating it head on, but rather just stalling it with repeated what we call chump blocks, like unsuccessful, just ends the battle as a stalemate, false prophecy, ignores the heroes, blocks obedience, protects from the heroes, and these ratios are very geared toward that specific game plan. I'll put out another video in the future and link it up here once it's done that talks more about building mid-range or defense-heavy decks. Another question that you might have is, what about good enhancements? How many good enhancements am I supposed to run? Well, the surprisingly simple answer to that is whatever space you have left after you follow all the other rules. You'll end up with a nice hollow space in your deck after you've put in the correct amount of all the other card types, and you just fill it up to 50 with the good enhancements that you want to run. So yeah, that's my guide to building speed decks in a nutshell, and I hope that this info helps you build better decks. Another thing you might be wondering about is, what about the reserve? You didn't talk about the reserve. What cards am I supposed to put in my reserve? That's a good question, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the tempo video that I mentioned earlier, or you can check out this video right here, where I talk specifically about my thought process when putting together a reserve.